So we're not done with Luke's gospel. There's a couple random little intertwined stories in there that I've grouped up to do a little bit later regarding Luke's idea of prayer and Luke's idea of money. But here we kind of wrap up some of the unique stories that I think center around the idea of Luke's idea of Jesus and the kingdom. And I think this, ending the gospel, is one of Luke's best unique stories that only he gets to tell us. And for those of you who know, Luke gives us a lot of really popular stories. He gives us the prodigal son, that's a good one. The birth narrative, Simon at the temple, the thieves on the cross next to Jesus, really good ones. But this one on the road to Emmaus is, I think, highlights and kind of completes Luke's message to all of them. It's got all the things you want in a good story. It's got suspense and intrigue, there's drama, it all happens through this story that Luke gives us. Here's the thing. Did any of you, like I do when I read this story, find yourself smiling at one point in this when they're walking along the road and Jesus comes up behind them? Do you smile there? That's when I start to smile. And I caught myself doing it here again, because really it's a smile of condensation, right? Of I know something you don't know. You with me? They got a little dramatic irony happening here. Like, I know Jesus is walking behind you, and they don't know that yet. You get me? I know something they don't know. And I could look at them in that and think that you've got this inside track that they don't have yet. They don't know how the story ends. But they'll get it pretty soon. And then that's where it gets to me, that the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus and then back to Jerusalem again is not just the journey for the people to Emmaus, but it's the one that the Gospel of Luke takes us on and the one that we continue to journey through all of our growth in Christianity. This journey to Emmaus and back. And a lot of times we don't even realize we're on the road, which is how we know we're on it. We don't know Jesus is walking behind us just yet. There's somewhere in this story about 8 or 9 references to being on the road. And I think the whole time that we think of this story as being the one that ends in Emmaus. After all, the story, we know it. It's called the road to Emmaus. There's a thing called an Emmaus walk. There's the road to Emmaus. But that's not actually where the story ends. It goes all the way back to Jerusalem. If you track the movements of the story, there's like 3 distinct movements to it. It starts in Jerusalem, where they're there, and then they walk on the way to a town over here called Emmaus, and then it ends with them going all the way back to we're alive, good, we're here, we're cooking on all cylinders, right? So there's really this 3 movements. Jerusalem, and they start there and they head down the path as the road heads to Emmaus. And then in Emmaus, they recognize Jesus in this home. And then when they recognize him, they turn right back around and they go back to Jerusalem. That's how the story finally ends. Underneath these 3 movements are these 3 sensations for these disciples as they go along. And the first one is disappointment. There's really profound disappointment at the very beginning. It's followed by an awakening. This epiphany, this aha moment, where their eyes are finally opened up to everything, and it ends with reunion with the other disciples. So disappointment, amazement, to reunion. You with me? These 3 movements follow this along the way. So Luke 24:13. I'm going to jump my way through this. We're going to do the whole darn thing together. Now the same day, the 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. So while they're walking, they're walking along the way. Jesus comes up behind them. It's like a horror movie, really. He sneaks up behind them and starts walking with him. And it says they don't recognize him. And then it says later on, while they were walking down the road, one of the disciples said about their colleagues, their friends, that they ran to the tomb in verse 24. And they say that they found the tomb empty. They're having a conversation about all the happenings. But they didn't see anybody in there again. That phrase, seeing, appears again. So they don't see Jesus come up behind them. They went to go see in the tomb, but they don't see Jesus in there. Then if you look way down in verse 31 at the end of this whole story, it finally says, suddenly, their eyes were opened and they recognized him. There's this subplot underneath this story and all these other movements about disciples learning to see. They're walking, they don't see Jesus, they don't recognize him. They went to the tomb to see things. They don't see Jesus there. They don't recognize, then suddenly their eyes are opened. You see this learn to see movement. They're learning how to do this. Apparently, the seeing and recognizing are two completely different things. You don't recognize it unless you're able to connect with something from the past. Recognition means you've seen it and you've seen it again. So you're seeing something again for the second time. So when you're looking at it, you go back into your brain and you go, oh, I know what that is. I know what that is. So you can see stuff and not recognize it. So is it possible then to recognize something you can't see? These are questions I think about. In Ephesians 1, Paul writes, I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened. Anybody in here have eyeballs in their heart? If you do, I'll call an ambulance, right? What he means, though, is like, I pray that you will learn to see things with your heart. If you remember our words when we did the Shema prayer, the heart is like the center of like the ethos of your person, right? That you can see with who you are, your being. Not just with your eyes, because those only go so far. If you have to see everything to believe in it, right? This is what he's getting at. But if you can learn to recognize what you can't even see with your eyes, then your faith moves up to the next level. This is how Paul gets in this in Ephesians 1. So their journey for this seeing, this growth through these movements, begins in... Good, we're alive. And it begins with disappointment. And they can't... Good, you got all the movements? You ready to do this? We're alive. Okay. Apparently there's a circle of believers there that are meeting in someone's house, maybe 2 or 3 homes. There's enough of them though. And what it says at the end of this story is that the disciples gather back into Jerusalem along with some of their friends. But these 2 disciples, that are walking down the road, don't know the whole story just yet. Somehow, for some reason, in this community of believers, these disciples that are gathered together in all these rooms after the crucifixion, they decided to leave it. They left the community of disciples. I don't know if you've caught that little piece of them yet, but some stayed, and those 2 left. So the disciples are still together, but these 2 decided that their grief is overwhelming, and they want to just go back home. They're done. Do you catch their mood suddenly? I think sometimes you plop into the road to Emmaus, and there's just like 2 dudes walking, and then Jesus shows up, and you're like, oh, that's really great. These guys have left everything. They're disappointed. They are grieving so much they've left the community that they were with for the however many last few years, if they've been with Jesus for so long, and they are going home. They're done. They're walking away. And so they're on the road to Emmaus, when suddenly Jesus sneaks up behind them. And he asks them a great question that I'll read it here, and then I'll read a great translation. He says, in verse 17, what are you discussing together as you walk along? In better translation of it, it's funnier. It's like watching Wimbledon was just on. You ever people watch tennis live? It's, this. This is literally what Jesus kind of says to them. He goes, what are the things you're saying back and forth to each other? That's a better, what are these things you're ping-ponging back and forth between each other? It's a little different than just like, hey, what are you saying? What are you guys doing, really? What are the words that you're using as you walk on this road? And one of them turns to look at Jesus, and he's got that sad puppy dog face, and he says, are you the only person in the entire city that doesn't know what's happened? Are you the only one who has no idea what's going on? And Jesus says, what things? Now, it can feel a little cat and mousey on that one, right? Like a little bit of like, he's getting them. But it's not. It's not going to be a bait and switch. He's not baiting them into some weird answer. This isn't the Pharisees being like, well, tell me who's my neighbor then, and waiting to entrap, right? He's opening up a door open. He's throwing it open for them to interpret, for you to interpret just exactly what you've just been reading. Are you the only one who doesn't know what happened? It's pretty self-evident. We know what's happened because we've been reading the story, and it seems you are the only one who doesn't get it. But it's Jesus' invitation to start talking about the things that you saw. And every single thing that they tell Jesus in there is a fact that Luke has given us. They say there was a prophet named Jesus of Nazareth. He was mighty, indeed, great before God and all the people. And then the leaders took him and they crucified him. And we'd hoped that he would be the one that would redeem Israel. And then to make it worse, the women run to the tomb and they say his body is gone. And so our friends went and looked at the tomb, and sure enough, there's no body in there. All true from Luke's story. And this is where Jesus, if the door was swinging open, he puts his boot on it and kicks it as far open as he possibly could at this point. And he says, you guys can't believe what the prophets prophesied, can you? You don't believe everything that was said beforehand. Because in the middle of this disappointing situation, in the most crucial thing is how they would interpret those prophecies. And 100% of the time, I can guarantee you, in your situation, you'll think that you interpret everything right. You will relay the facts. Only the facts. What you don't realize is that it's like a door, and you can't get to the other side of it with just the facts. Or if you could get to the other side, you would see an entirely different world of explanations about those things, those facts. But you can't see it, and so you stand on your side of the door, and you keep knocking, hoping for a better explanation than the facts that you have given. But the only thing you have left are the facts that you have to deal with. I'll tie it up. Here we go. Well, this will help it make sense. Some of you this morning, or at some point in your existence, have entered into a moment of desperation. I've been there. Let's just all picture one in our head where we were like, all right, this is about worst case scenario, and I'm there. Good. And so for you, in a moment, Jesus can be a little shallow and a little bit thin. You're walking with these people from Emmaus. There was something that made sense, now it doesn't make sense. You're walking, you have the facts of the crap that happened in your life, but that's what you're clinging on to. And you're walking on the miserable road on your way to Emmaus, and Jesus, it seems like he's a little shallow and a little bit thin. You wanted a job, you didn't get it. You wanted to pass the thing and you didn't get that. The trial that you were getting sued for went the other way and you owed someone a lot of money. You've been abandoned by someone you thought cared about you. You prayed for healing and it didn't happen. Someone died who didn't deserve it. You following me? You've got the facts. An unthinkable, sudden thing in the middle of the night, and you're called into a moment and everything in the world has changed. You have left the comfort of the brothers in Jerusalem and you are walking the road to Emmaus. And you were asked that day to come into church and temporarily suspend your disbelief about what the world is really like. You're supposed to come in here and you're happy, shiny people. Gotta smile. Gotta look good. And you can hardly do it. You can't get to the other side of the door any faster, but there is another side to it. There's another explanation of the things. All of the facts that you say can be absolutely true. Everything that you say and feel can be absolutely right, but you don't know everything. You're walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus. You with me? The leaves of the New Testament rustle with the rumors that things that are will not always be. And God willing, there'll be a day when you can enter the other side of the door. And in the moment, the door is swung open. It's not really the place in the story where you start to smile when Jesus comes up, if you think about it. You might start to smile there because you realize it's Jesus. Don't you? These guys are in the worst day of their whole life. They're traveling the road, they're weeping, they're sad, they've given up on everything, and Jesus pops up behind them. And that's where you want to smile, right? Because you know verse 31. You already know verse 31. You know how it ends. Then their eyes were open and they recognized him. You've got it. You recognize Jesus in that moment. You're in verse 31, but the people walking are in verse 16. But they were kept from recognizing him. You can't get any faster to verse 31 than you can get there. Sometimes the only thing you can do is remember that a verse 31 exists. Even though there's not an explanation that you might accept or that you could grieve with, there is one on the other side of the door. There are things that you don't know. There are things that I don't know. There's another side to the door. There's still verse 31. Sometimes you just have to stop and remember that somebody knows something that you don't know. Somebody has some piece of information in this world or out of it, and they're living in verse 31 while you're in verse 16. But you have to stay where you're at. And if you're not there, someday it will be real for you. Jesus proceeds to go through all the scriptures and open the scriptures and explain to them all these things that have happened, all this other side of the door information. All of the stuff works. He explains all these happenings and how it fits and weaves into these prophecies. And it makes sense to Jesus. He's coming at it from another angle, not from their angle. He's explaining the scriptures and trying to bring the whole thing together. And there's this moment, this awkward moment at the end of the journey. Jesus has been explaining and opening their eyes, and they're like, okay, yeah, kinda, I want to keep learning about this. Awkward moment. They reach Emmaus, and it's almost dark out, and the disciples are ready to go home. And then Jesus, he does this, he basically pretends that he's going to keep going. He's going to keep going. He's like, you guys have a good time. Good night. I know it's pitch black. I'm going to keep walking in the dark away from the town. You good. You with me? He pretends he's going to keep going. What would have happened if he did just keep going? Right? We wouldn't have the third part of the story. Because it was inside that their eyes were opened and they recognized him. So there's this really fragile moment at the very end of this road where they're still trying to process, where they still haven't figured it out, where they still don't know how it ends, where they still are confused, they still feel like garbage. He's pretending like he's going to keep going, and the disciples stop him and they say, you got to stay in here for the night. It's getting late. And so he says to them, really fragile moment. Do you see this fleeting, fragile moment passes? And so he goes inside the house, and he picks up the bread on the table, and he blesses it, and he breaks it, and he gives it to them, and then boom, suddenly their eyes are open, and they recognize him. That's kind of an odd thing. Right? Did his appearance change? Is he Superman now it's like hypno glasses versus now. Mary thought he was the gardener. He comes back from the dead. There's enough of something in his appearance. Right? Maybe they recognize him not by the appearance, but by the actions. Not by the way he looks, but in what he's doing that's ringing the bell. And the lights come on and their eyes are open. And then the weirdest thing in the story happens. The strangest thing. The moment they recognize him, he disappears. Weird, right? The whole story is about learning to recognize Jesus in the midst of disappointment. And the second you recognize him, he's gone. That's weird, right? That's kind of strange. And all throughout the resurrection appearances, Jesus is coming and going. And the second that they see him, he's gone. And I wonder, are we being taught another way to see? Is he trying to say things like, just because you don't see me doesn't mean I'm not there? I can be present even when it feels like I'm not? Because the moment that their eyes are opened, that's when they go back to the journey to Jerusalem. One of them says, wait, didn't our hearts burn within us when before he opened our eyes? No, our hearts were burning with us when he talked along the way. Long before we started to see him and recognize him, he was making sense of stuff. He was putting scriptures together for us. And even though I couldn't see him, I guess I recognized him. He was in the fellowship of believers that we left in Jerusalem. He was in the scriptures as they were being opened to us as he taught. He was in the breaking of the bread. He was in the hospitalities of the disciples that we brought him into this thing. He's with our brothers back in Jerusalem. Maybe there are moments along the way on our journey from Emmaus to Jerusalem where it seems like Jesus is absent, but he's actually there the entire time, even if you don't see him with your eyes. There's some other reality you've been blinded to, some other side of the door. There's resurrection in this life. There's being seated with Christ as in heaven, and they start to come together. Can I ask anyone if you've ever been trapped in disappointment? Have you ever heard him peep at you along the way? Ever opened scriptures where you were trapped? Called memory verses that you knew when you were a kid but didn't make sense in the moment? Jesus can be present even if you think he's not. He can appear in the reading of scripture just as he did moments ago for them. He can show up in the body of believers as long as you keep waiting to see him with eyes. You may be stuck in a certain point of the journey, but if you can learn to recognize what you can't see, there's a new reality. And that's really what we've got to do, is slip into this new reality, this other reality. There's always more happening in a moment than we could ever know. Things don't always appear as they seem. And the moment their eyes are opened, they recognize he disappears. And what do? Do they sit down and have a service? They were like, oh, we've got to do communion right now, where he broke it. We're going to sit and eat it, and then maybe we'll crack open the hymnal, and we'll do that, a couple songs together, and then someone will pray, obviously, and then we'll change the pyramid colors. No, that's not what they did, right? So, do they start to celebrate? No. The next verse is, within the hour, they were on their way back down the road, on their way back to Jerusalem. And that's where this little odd story gets to the last little bit of odd. Up until this point in Luke's narrative, the disciples have followed Jesus wherever he went. This is the first time where Jesus actually follows them. They can't stick around. They leave. And somewhere at the end of their journey, you should be thinking, he came after them. He followed them. Did you just catch it? He came looking for them. This is a story only Luke tells. If you're here this morning, and you ever have thought, there is no explanation for the things that are happening, remember these things. You don't have to go following Christ. Sorry, I wait for the lightning bolt sometimes when I say things. I'm going to say it again. Shh. You don't have to go following him. Great. If an evangelical heard me saying that, there'd be panic in the room. You don't have to go follow him. Woo! There are times when Christ will follow you first. He'll follow you with people and words and texts and events and rituals that seem foreign, cold, and shallow and make absolutely no sense to you. But my prayer is that someday you will look back on those journeys from Emmaus to Jerusalem when you're like, I'm not following him. I don't even know where he is. You look back at those and say, my goodness, all along the way, he was there and I didn't even know it. There's this last scene in Luke 24, verse 36. When the disciples, when they were still there talking about Jesus, Jesus himself stood among them and said, peace be with you. There's this moment, the disciples come running back to Jerusalem, and they've all gathered back into the circle, and they've been already said amongst themselves that the Lord has risen as he appeared to Peter, and the guy, who's denied him the whole time, to Peter, right? And in the midst of all that, these guys tell their story about what happened to them on the road to Emmaus. And in verse 36, it says, Jesus suddenly appears to them and said, peace, be still. And that's all they get. That's it. That's all they get to hear. Sometimes that's all we get. If you're tired, if you're disappointed, if days seem hard, if it seems like suspend your disbelief for just a moment to enter into church, I got to be smiley, happy people, you don't have to do that. You're in the right place. You're where you're supposed to be. You're in a body of believers. You don't have to have things figured out. You only walk at your own speed. There are people who know something that you don't know. And the smile on their face is genuine. They're verse 31 people. All you've got to remember is that in the moment that he appears to you, let him in. And then soon you can come back to the body of believers. And now, sometimes, in the midterm, all you get to hear is, peace be with you. Let's pray.